Do life's greatest questions seem like a mystery? Well, we're probably going to talk about it here at Appalachian Liturgy. Important questions like, are you a Jedi or an Imperial? Is oatmeal actually a breakfast cereal? Is a Catholic weekday really called a ferial? Did you know that Mr. Rogers was Presbyterial? So join us as we have a little fun talking about thy kingdom come. Appalachian Liturgy.
Okay, welcome everyone to the Appalachian Liturgy podcast. I am Justin Stacy.
Reverend Brooke Ashley.
And I'm Justin Bowen.
And tonight we are going to talk about purity culture. But before we do, there are some housekeeping items that we need to take care of. First, we've got t-shirts. Appalachian Liturgy podcast t-shirts. These are the white vestment colors, and they will be available through the Easter season, probably all the way to the end of May. And then after that, we will have red available. So please.
Pentecost.
Exactly, Pentecost. So please check out our website, appalachianliturgy.com, and there is a shopping section there, and that will take you to our Teespring store. You can also find the store on Teespring if you're just browsing there. Also, give our video a like and subscribe to our channel. All right, that's the housekeeping items I needed to go over. So let's dive into purity culture. I know, Brooke, we've hinted a few times before that we wanted to talk about maybe sexual sins, that we could do a podcast on sexual sins. And I feel like we can encapsulate a lot of those ideas in purity culture, the topic of purity culture. And I don't even know if we agree on what it is. Like I think you and I have disputed what it was, but I believe I agree with you now. Like I've looked up the definition of what most people in the evangelical world call it. And
yes,
it's what you said. But I do think they're related, though. So
you want to tell everybody what you thought, and then what I thought, and what's the right one?
So yeah. So what I was thinking purity culture is sort of the lack of accountability that the church has given, like clergy and pastors and whatever, when it comes to sexual sins. There's a lot of secrecy, and it's to keep. In my mind, that's to keep the church pure. You know, you don't want the church to look bad. So in my mind, that's what purity culture was. But
we can do a whole episode.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, but you're just totally wrong.
Yeah. So, Brooke, explain what you said it was, and this is the right answer.
Yeah, so for me, the thought of purity culture was, or is, the idea of, it was really popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, this idea of keeping yourself physically pure before marriage. And there was a lot of push for purity rings and all this conversation, especially around teenagers. There were a lot of books that came out about dating and just kind of what we thought as the church or as Christian culture about all of that. And I think there's a lot of pressure from adults on teens that I think has really backfired. I think it was harmful.
Oh, yeah.
And I think I can say that I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s when some of this was just taking hold. And then Aaron and I were in vocational youth ministry during the height of the purity culture. And so we saw this swing from sexual freedom, if you will, to this real hard purity culture. And it was very confusing and very harmful in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of literature that's come out in the last 4 or 5 years, maybe longer than that, about how harmful that was to people's marriages now, and the way they view sexuality. So that's where I'd go from that.
That's what I think of too is, and I think the distinction is both things you all are talking about are problems that exist, but one of them is like not holding somebody accountable, while the other one's like holding somebody accountable to the point of actually shaming them type thing. So there's two separate problems, but yeah. But I think it's important that you talk about that time frame of the 90s, and comparing it to the sexual freedom, because that's really what it connects to when you think about like the time difference. These people who would have been involved heavily in youth ministry in the 90s were the people who would have been coming to age in the sexual revolution of like the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And so it's a very pendulum swinging,
So
reaction against that.
When we first got into vocational youth ministry, meaning that's how we made our living, right? We worked full time with teenagers, college, young adults, that kind of thing. When you talked about sexual education, it was very different. And I can remember bringing in paid Christian sexual educators, the one and only time we did it. And they just threw these provocative, pornographic images in front of all the kids, and it was supposed to shock them. It was supposed to break the ice, if you will, and get them talking. And we were done with that. But they were, boomers, if you will. They kind of grew up in the sexual freedom thing. And so they had a really different view on what Christian education should be about with sexuality. The other thing that I will say is I don't think that the church does a good job in talking about sexuality anyway. I mean, other than your youth having a sex talk every now and then, or the real purity kind of, you shouldn't do anything, you should do everything but it. I mean, that was kind of one of the things one time, we don't talk about it. And so what we've done is we've made it a taboo subject. And so we have actually given our authority away, if you will, about talking about sexuality to our secular culture. So, I mean, we can't be shocked when the people who come to church, who claim to be Christians, have a whacked view of sexuality when we're not willing to talk about it. So that's my soapbox for the night.
Yeah, I completely agree. What's interesting is, I didn't really grow up in the church. I was 16 when I was first joined a church. And by that time, I was well into my sexuality.
Sure.
So I'd already figured things out. And I hadn't, not growing up in a church. And the few years that I was in that church specifically, they had never mentioned anything about that. The only thing that they would ever touch on was, why homosexuality is an abomination. But there was never anything about the other, what would be affecting me. So
were you ever involved in youth groups when you were 16 or 17?
No, I wasn't.
That's where I feel like it kind of had its epicenter, at least in my experience with it.
Well, I think, what happened was sex was talked about in such a way that it was bad, it was dirty, it was something that you only did once you were married, and they fell short of saying, and women shouldn't enjoy it. I mean, they fell short of that, but that was kind of there, that was something that a woman just should do because that was kind of her role or whatever. And so we had this whole generation of women who actually felt guilty after they were married for having sex because it was such a shameful topic. And then you were just supposed to flip a switch. I mean, it really messed with people's psyche, I think.
Yeah. I will say that just growing up where I did, the culture itself was kind of molded into those beliefs. So even though I didn't grow up in church and get it from there, I definitely felt shame in wanting to have sex with another person. But it was more from the aspect of not having a kid. Because what I heard, at least in parts of my family and whatnot, is if you screw up, if you have a kid too early, then you're going to ruin your life. Yeah. And so it wasn't really the God's going to be mad at you that made me afraid of it. It was I can't have a kid because I've got to get through college and I've got to have this perfect life that my parents and family has set out for me. So that was the shame that I felt, which it could be kind of related, but still, it wasn't the more church aspect of it.
Yeah, I think it's probably related, but the stuff I remember sticking out the most, and I think gets brought up a lot, is like, I specifically remember people saying stuff like, if you get married and you sleep with your wife, you're sleeping with every man that she's ever slept with, or something like that. And it's always positioned, like Brooke said, in that direction type thing too. It's positioned against, like down, denigrating the woman in the relationship, and like that type of thing. And that's the specific stuff I remember hearing at, conferences with youth groups. That exact comparison was made a lot.
So did you ever see the chart? Like the chart where it had like you and your significant other, and then it just went down from there. So I was coming to age in my teenage years, and that height of, figuring out your own sexuality and what all that during I think the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic. So a lot of what I grew up with hearing really was safety kind of
like
thing.
STD related type stuff.
Yeah, STD. There was never a conversation around the psychological components of sex or the spiritual components of sex. And then you came upon this purity culture. I mean, you really went from one into the other. I mean, it was kind of crazy. But yeah, and I think as the church, we've taken on this puritanical idea that sex is bad, sex is only for procreation. The whole idea of anything pleasurable is bad. So, there's this whole kind of thing that if you enjoy sex, somehow you're dirty. I mean, I hate to break it to people, but I can't find scripture to back that up.
Yeah.
Hezekiah 3:4.
Yeah. I mean, as far as scripture, I think a lot of these Puritan ethics when it comes to sexuality comes from Paul, and it's 1 Corinthians 6 and I think it's Romans something, where he lists specific sexual sins, and he even emphasizes that sexual sins, because your body's a temple, that is the reason why we should be pure when it comes to sexual sins. So I feel like that is where this comes from, but how do we deal with that? Like, because I've definitely wrestled with those pieces of scripture too. Like, if purity culture has these negative effects, and it does, like it really, really does. How do we then? What is the sexual ethic that we should follow?
I think we celebrate that sex is a gift. I mean, so if we are created in the image of God, if God has created us, and God created humanity and said God, and it is good, right? Then I think the leap can be made that God created sex to be pleasurable. I mean, I don't think that was a mistake. But there's also responsibility that comes with that. I said, so there needs to be this balance. I mean, we need to talk about it. I mean, y'all, and I hope our listeners know, I'm a pastor. I'm married. My husband is a pastor. And people like freak out if we make any kind of sexual innuendo, or if we are touchy-feely. They're like, what the heck? Like, I mean, I can remember
inappropriate flirting with your husband, Brooke.
Yes. Washing dishes at a potluck dinner with another lady, and all the women are in there. And I mean, I don't know if y'all know this, but men get a bad rap for locker room talk, but women are just as bad. So let me just tell you. So we were in the kitchen, and there were sexual innuendo conversations going on, and I jumped into the conversation, and the lady dropped a glass and almost broke it in the sink because she couldn't handle the thought of her pastor ever having sex. And so I just turned around and just said, okay, so everybody in this room, just let me tell you, your pastor has sex on a regular basis, and it's good. And they about died.
Say, was the rest of the room very uncomfortable after that?
Yes, it was very
That's great.
But we don't. We've talked about it in such a negative light for so long that it has become a taboo subject. And thankfully, we've got a generation of kids really coming behind us who are not letting us do that anymore.
And I think that's a good point that you brought up too, Justin, about like Paul talking about these things. And I think there's a couple of things there that come to my mind immediately. One is that, one is like there's a truth that this purity culture came out of. There's a reason it was responding to something bad, like a lot of the sexual revolution stuff, a lot of the high STD rates in the 70s and 80s. So it was responding to something bad that existed. And also, there is a call biblically to be pure. I'm having trouble with English today. I just keep throwing on my words.
You're just all flabbergasted because we're talking about that's what it is.
but yeah, we have to remember the context Paul was writing in. We have to remember that the early Christians were ridiculed because they wouldn't let other people sleep with their spouses. Like Roman culture was a very different sexual culture than what we're used to today. And so he's giving these advice because they were really abusing that specifically. While that's not necessarily the same type of case in a Western culture that's coming out of 1600 years of Christendom with those type of values kind of embedded in us, we don't really, to put it in Roman terms, we don't have weekly orgies at the place downtown or something like that. At least most of us don't. But
I mean, do you think purity culture still exists?
I think it does. I think there's been a recent pushback against it. And I think one key proof of that is, are you familiar with the book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye?
Yes.
It's kind of like the manifesto of purity culture. So that was wrote by a guy named Joshua Harris, I think is his name.
Yeah.
And he wrote that book. Yeah. So he wrote it in the early 90s. It was talking about how, we need to quit dating. We need to court people instead. Your focus only has to be on marriage. You can't enjoy dating. It's like that Pharisaical method that y'all are talking about. Like not even can you sin, but you have to stay so far away from the sin that you're not even tempted to sin. You're not even near occasion of sin at all, type thing. And so he wrote all this stuff, and it was pretty symbolic of a lot of the, you're ruined as a person if you have sex before marriage.
It was the book.
Oh yeah.
In the height of the purity culture. I mean, I can't remember how many books got handed out to youth groups through the years. But he did. One of the things he talked about was that you dated for marriage. So if it was somebody, that if it was somebody that you could not see yourself married to, you just didn't even go out on a date. So this whole idea, and I think that we see this in our young people now even. So if you went out with somebody, you were committed to that person already.
Yes, and that's so problematic.
Yeah, there was no kind of getting to know you or anything. I mean, if you went out, you were a couple.
And there's lots of things you should work together through as a married couple that you shouldn't feel the responsibility to work through as a person that's just now starting to date somebody. So that obviously has those type of repercussions on top of that. But yeah, in the 2010, sometime around there, he came back out and said, I made an oops. I shouldn't have wrote that book. I take back a lot of stuff I said. He talked about these same type of things. Like I was downplaying grace, the forgiveness that we all have. We all come in with mistakes, but I was putting so much exclusivity on the idea that if you made a sexual sin mistake, your marriage is ruined, while you could have made all these other mistakes and somehow you can work together and grow towards Christ as a married couple. And I mean, that's really kind of the long and short of it, isn't it? Like that's the problem with purity culture, is it picks out this one sin and acts like it's the almost unforgivable sin type thing. It ruins you permanently.
Yeah, and I think, talking about Paul and this idea that our body is a temple, I mean, I think that's important. However, we sin against our bodies in so many ways. I mean, look at, I enjoy a dessert a lot. I mean, a lot of us do.
I do too.
I carry extra weight that I know that I shouldn't. I know what I should do. I know that I should take care of my physical body better. That is really no different than a sexual sin. But nobody really talks about it,
Right. And like telling a white lie, or telling a lie in general. Everybody knows that people lie, and everybody's lied. And that's not a sin that anyone thinks is any worse than anything else. And it's easily forgivable. But it's just as bad as a sexual sin,
So, too, I mean, I think we've had this conversation. I know it's been creeping up in my life with folks a lot, is that those of us, quote, inside the church tend to give grace to to the people that are with us inside the church about sin.
Yep.
Yet we hold people outside the church to a
Yeah.
different standard, and they're not even professing to follow Christ. Like they've not had this introduction. They've not experienced grace. They've, and that's what confuses me with the church. Like we want to, and then we wonder, well, why don't these people want to follow Jesus?
And even if we're going to use Paul as justification to do that, he held people to a different standard before they were Christian. If they, it's
Exactly.
we're leaving that part out.
So when you look at Paul's writings, he's not writing to just the general citizen most of the time. He's most of the time writing to the people who are calling themselves Christians inside the church. And he's saying, what do you think you're doing? You don't look different than the culture, and you should.
Right.
So,
and I think the key is, like what you said, we need to focus on what is good in marriage, what is good in sexuality. There's some writings from John Paul II, the Theology of the Body. It's kind of the collection of writings that he's wrote on like the goodness of sexuality and stuff like that. And it's got a lot of really good stuff in it. It doesn't catch on quite as much as something like the Kissing, Dating, Goodbye, because it doesn't have like an explicit set of rules that you have to follow or something like that.
Right.
But I think in emphasizing that we have these rules of, keeping your body pure, keeping yourself pure, because it's leading us towards something good, and that's what it's for, focusing on what the good thing is we're trying to accomplish, rather than being like, oh, well, you've messed up, you're broken now, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right. Like, there's no grace for that.
Yeah. There's no room for grace in that type of viewpoint.
Yep.
And I think that's where the damage came. I mean, I don't know, looking back, do I wish that I had not done certain things? Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we leave out a lot of times is there are psychological consequences. There are, there in any intimate act, in any intimate act. I think one of the things that really bothered me the most in the height of the purity movement, the purity thing, was there was this emphasis on, if you were dating, you should be praying together and praying for one another. You want to talk about an intimate act. Praying together for one another is a hugely intimate act. And when we were doing youth ministry, we actually cautioned people against that. It can be manipulative, just like you can use sex to be manipulative. It's just not a healthy thing to do unless you're in a mature relationship. And so we've left all that out,
Do you think, so I know I said there's been some pushback against it, and I think there has, but I've been outside of, youth ministry since I've been in it, which is quite a few years now at this point. Maybe you're a little bit closer to it, Brooke, and I don't know if you know anything either, Justin, but do you all have any awareness if there's been attempts of changes of that in the youth ministry directly, or is it just outside of it that's been pushback?
I mean, I can only speak for the denomination and the tradition that I'm in. And it straddles the line between mainline and evangelical. Sometimes it's more mainline, sometimes it's more evangelical, but I do think that there's a pushback to talk more about holistic relationships, and I've seen that as my girls have grown up. I mean, I have a almost 22 and 20-year-old. And so, when they were in youth ministry and stuff, it was more about relationships, and loving oneself, and being confident in oneself. I also think something that changed is this push for equality and gender equality. I think that's kind of changed the conversation when we talk about sexuality in the church. I look at over the last 30 years, from when I was a teen till now, and in that conversation, it really was more about, the woman's role in a sexual relationship was just to meet the needs of the man. Honestly, that when growing up. So, but I think some of that's changed. So I do think that there's been a pendulum swing, we see pendulum swings all the time. I do think maybe it swung too far.
Doesn't it always though?
And I think
it has to before it comes back to the middle.
Yeah. So I think what happened with the purity culture, you had this strict definition of what was acceptable and what wasn't. And I can remember having youth members, and I won't say their names, could totally embarrass them, who wanted us to dictate exactly where the line was.
Yeah.
Like what body part could you touch? What could you do? Instead of having the holistic conversation about boundaries and those kind of things, and I think now some of the conversations is maybe what feels comfortable for me may not be what feels comfortable for you, and this idea of virginity is not the idol. Like, I mean, the purity culture made virginity an idol. So I taught abstinence-based sexual education in the public schools for several years. And man alive, those kids could tell you all the things that you could do up until it. Like the things, and what I wanted to say to them, and what I did say to them is those are all intimate acts as well. And it's the intimacy that we're talking about. It's the vulnerability of you giving yourself to somebody. That vaginal intercourse is not the, it's not the idol, but man alive, it was made that way through the purity culture.
Yeah. And again, coming from my background, that's exactly what my mind frame was. As long as we don't do vaginal intercourse, we're fine. Because it doesn't count, but in my mind, I was just worried about pregnancy. Like that was the only thing that I was worried about. So we did wait for that part. But, so I don't know. It's really interesting. Another point I wanted to make is that for the guys, I know there was a lot of gender roles in purity culture targeting the females, but for the males, at least over the past, let's say 20 years, if you buy into that, I feel like it's created the atmosphere, the environment to promote porn and promote other things that's not with someone. So you're going to still sin. It's just something more secret, something you can keep more hid than what you could having sex with your partner. And that's destructive. I mean, and I think it was like a tweet or something I read not long ago, and they were talking about, how do we deal with a generation of youth pastors that have grown up on porn?
So pornography is a huge issue among clergy.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. And I'll push this further. So I quit, and I may have told y'all this before, but I quit reading romance novels because it gave me a warped sense of what a relationship should be like.
Yeah.
Very much like pornography does.
Yep.
And so again, I'm not condemning people who read romance novels. Like, I have a really good friend who's a romance novel author, but for me, I was setting my husband up for failure.
Yep.
In those romance novels.
Yeah, I think there's two really good points there. Like, I had never thought about that connection between purity culture and pornography, but that makes a lot of sense, and it falls in line with like what Brooke was talking about technically it's not, the worst thing, so therefore I didn't do anything wrong or something like that. I didn't cross the line, so therefore it's okay.
Yep.
And I think you're talking about not reading romance novels personally is the good connection to like what purity culture got wrong, and that they made these universal rules of avoiding near occasions of sin that applied to everybody. And that's not always the case. For some people, maybe you need to avoid more things than even what they were saying. For some people, they were going way too far, and you're just like frustrating people for no reason. Right. So I think it's the near occasion of sin stuff. That's a real thing. But that's not always going to be the same for the same person, because it's what makes you more likely to fall into sin. I
also think that's the danger and the complexity of applying the Bible, Scripture, to everything, making it universal. So you're taking things that Paul said to the Corinthians, and you're okay. That blankets over everyone, and I feel like it's more complex than that.
Well, that's why context is so important.
Exegesis is important.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this before. Eisegesis versus exegesis, and it's so important. And I really think that the purity culture movement drove this wedge between secular and spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And because as the church, we took this hardline stance, we did push people into pornography because, I mean, kids, teens, adults, they're curious. And if you can't talk about it in the community that surrounds you, you are going to look outside of that.
Yep. And I think that keys into what you said earlier, almost what you wanted to compare it to, Justin. It's very close to that, I think, in that it makes people not want to talk about things personally.
Yes.
Like, we're okay with talking about where we fall short in other areas, but for the purity culture movement made it even harder because, I mean, our sexuality is already something very personal anyway, but that push made it even harder for people to talk about where you may have had struggles at in the past with people. And so it becomes like something you can't even talk with your closest spiritual directors and the people that you should be talking to about it. So it's very reclusive, and that's where problems can develop.
And what I had in mind was, the most recent thing I think was the Ravi, the evangelical ministry, Ravi something other, I forget his name, but I think he was in Australia, wasn't he? Is that where he was out of?
I'm unsure which one you're talking about.
Anyway, he's passed away now, but it was after he passed away.
Ravi Zacharias.
Yeah.
Right? However you say it.
Yeah. They found out about all of these, adultery and all these sexual allegations and harassment, and all this stuff.
So don't you think that kind of ties into this whole idea of purity culture? I mean, it kind of goes back to what, Stacey, that you were thinking about when you thought about purity culture.
Exactly.
And I can see how
Stacey's developing a smile. He's like, I am right.
I know, right? That was smart.
Everyone's coming to my side now.
But the purity culture and the sexual scandals of the church, but that same kind of idea of not talking about it, they kind of came up together.
But this is why I think they're different. And it's because if purity culture didn't exist, do we think people would be any more likely to talk about how they have sexually abused a minor? Because I would hope not. I would hope even without purity culture, that's not something that we would find acceptable.
No, but I do think if it hadn't have been for purity culture, people may have spoken out. Because I think because of purity culture, there's a guilt that came with not being pure anymore.
But we would still say that's not pure is my problem. Like even without purity culture being a thing, that's still something we're going to be like, that's very, very bad. And then if it comes out, you should be out of your position type of thing. I don't think purity culture, to me, created that situation. Like,
well, I mean, I guess the victim's not coming forward, like not talking about it.
Maybe on that note. I could see maybe on that. That's fair. I'm thinking more so on like the cover-up note.
Right, and I think from the institution standpoint, they're covering it up to try and remain pure, even though they're not trying to remain pure in the image of the public, of the perception. Exactly.
Sure, but even without purity culture, that's still going to be seen as impure.
Yeah,
because it's properly
institution
impure.
Issue. Yep. Right.
Yeah. I do think they're two different things, but I do think that the idea of purity culture have kept victims, whether they're been abused by people in the church or outside the church.
That's very fair. Yeah, I can definitely see that connection from the victim's point of view of not wanting to admit something because it's going to look like it's their fault or something.
Yeah,
That's fair.
And I think it was used. The purity culture was used against victims to keep them quiet because nobody's going to want you. You're soiled goods. That kind of.
That's fair. Everybody's around to Stacey's point of view. He was right all along. We were all
there. We go. That's all I wanted. That's all I wanted out of this podcast.
I just think it's important that if something is going on in the world, we need to be talking about it.
Yeah.
As the church, like it impacts us. And we, and people right now are screaming and yelling about how the church has lost its relevancy and blah, blah, blah. As the church, we've given up that authority because we've refused to have the conversation where the world is having it around us.
Yeah, yep. We're ceding ground by not.
Yeah. And so our voice has become quiet, and all people know now is conversation about how you shouldn't do it, or sex is bad, or, you know, fill in the blank. And so,
I think it's important to not shield kids from sex talk. I mean, they need to know. That's how they were birthed, so they need to know those type of things.
Yeah,
and I think
there's
parents
obviously
should be responsible.
A ramp up. You don't tell people
about obviously
when they're 3.
Obviously, but before they're able to research it online, I think it would be important to try to explain some things to them, because what I found out about everything came from online, and that's not a good way to learn.
The best way to learn is from 1970s VHS tapes in sex ed.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I mean, I think it's such a natural part of who we are, that it has to be talked about. I was very fortunate to grow up in a family where my parents were very affectionate to one another. That wasn't a secret in our family. I mean, it wasn't like they were getting it on in the living room or anything, but my sister and I grew up knowing that my parents loved each other. They found each other attractive. I mean, that was, and of course my girls being in their early 20s are like, oh, y'all are gross, like stop, and so, but we have always just joked with our kids and tried to be as open as we could developmentally when it was developmentally appropriate, and we've been that way too in the congregations that we've served, and that's easier, I think, when you're married serving together. Like you were saying earlier, people freak out a little bit sometimes when Aaron and I flirt with each other, but then what people will say is it's really refreshing because you look like human beings, like you're not robots.
Yeah.
Yep. So we should talk about what's good rather than just putting down.
Yeah. What's good, what's appropriate, and go from there.
Should we? I think the culture at large has kind of adopted, when it comes to sexuality, consent. Like that is the only thing that it matters, really. Like even the relationship part doesn't matter. I don't know that Christians should go that. I feel like that's too far on the pendulum, right? But consent's very important.
So.
I mean, but the relationship. I think you mentioned this earlier, Brooke, that in the youth ministries now, the relationship part is what's stressed. And I think that's very important. Even if you don't talk marriage, just having the committed relationship and loving the person, and because ultimately sexual relations is something holy too. It's pleasurable, but it's something holy, and we should look at it as a gift.
There's many times throughout Scripture that God describes his relationship with the church as the bride of Christ. That's for reasons. Yes. It's intimate.
Yeah. And I think, especially, and I would say this, well, and I do say this to whether you're an adult or you're a teenager, it's one of those things that once you cross that line, you can't back it up. Like it is really hard to do that. And I am a huge proponent that if a relationship is getting a little serious, as in physically serious or emotionally serious, that you have that very frank conversation early on. Because the best thing that you can do is I can hold you accountable and you can hold me accountable if we're in a relationship. And we need to know where those boundaries are. We need to know what's okay. And I think that's more than consent, Stacey. I think that's a respect and working through that. And that way you're being proactive about it, because we all know how this works with sex. If you don't talk about it, you're going to end up doing it. I mean, that's just kind of where you're at. And that's what happens.
So here's a question to both of you, since you're both parents and I'm not. if you are promoting to your kids the sexual ethic that you should wait to marriage, is it then okay to say, but if you don't, you need to be prepared? Like the plan, like, is that okay, or is that giving them a pass to go ahead and do it? Like, is that enticing them to go ahead and do it?
Okay, as somebody who taught sex ed, I will say this. Yes, I think that they need to know what their choices are. Now, am I going to tell my 12-year-old, well, if you decide, then I'm right there with, come to me and we'll talk about it. No, I mean, I don't think that there is at the younger ages that needs to happen. Right. I do think you do need to talk about the consequences, and not just pregnancy and STD, but some of the psychological, and statistics and studies show us that the younger you are when you start having sex, the more issues you have with attachment and commitment in relationships. And so that was what we talked about a lot with our kids, is that you're just not emotionally ready for this. Like, this is very emotionally charged, and, but I'm a proponent of, I don't think you sit there and you give them, like, have a smorgasbord and say, which options do you want, but I do think that people should have the choice. People want to act like kids are having sex younger and younger. The fact of the matter is people get married later and later. I mean, 2 generations ago, it was nothing to be married at 16, 17, and 18.
Right. 14 even.
Teenage pregnancy now.
There's a lot of laws that will protect up to 14 years old to be married.
Yeah. Well, my grandmother was laughing that on a Medicare thing, it wanted to know if she'd had sex before the age of 16.
Yeah.
She said, I don't know why Medicare needs to know that, but I got married at 15.
Right.
Yeah. So
it's different. It's a different generation, so we can't we can't just take what was appropriate then and say it's appropriate now, or that it's effective now, because it might not be.
My girls are very different, and Bowling will probably, his kids are they're all very different. So I don't think there's a one size fits all.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I haven't got to this age yet, so I guess I may change my mind in the next couple of years. But my thought is you need to give people reasons for why you're telling them something too. So, it's not like, if you're giving them reasons, you're saying, like, it's important to not do this because, like Brooke said, you're not emotionally ready yet. You're not in a permanent commitment situation, even though you might think that, it could turn into one, and all, that type of thing, and explain why it's important. And you're not giving them an out, but you're giving them reasons on why you think this is the case, rather than just saying that, no, you can't do this, but if you do, be safe.
Right. Yeah. This was actually one of the conversations quite a few weeks ago on the Holy Post that they had. Phil and Christian was both talking about their basically sex lives before marriage, and that they both admitted that they both had sex before marriage, and they were both Christians at the time, and that Phil said that basically if you are instructed to not have sex because it's sinful or whatever, then it's better to accidentally fall into it than to have planned to have done it. So if you planned and then you had the protections and whatnot, and I think they were kind of getting at that this leads to a lot of unwanted pregnancies, because you aren't planned, you accidentally slipped up and done it, and now there's consequences from that. Whereas if you were teaching, here is the sexual ethic and here is what you're striving to do, but you need to be prepared if you're going to make the choice to do this other thing. And I think that's why it's important, because, for a teenager, you need to know those consequences.
Well, and it was important for me as a parent, and Aaron and I had talked about this, and I think maybe having worked with so many teenagers and preteens through the years, we wanted to be the ones to be instructing our children. We wanted our voice to matter in this area and in this situation. We didn't want us to have to come in and undo the things that they had learned other places, and then they just look at us like, well, we're being the purity police, right? Like
Right.
we wanted to kind of get ahead of the curve, you know, and be like, this is something that you're going to question. And yeah, I mean, nobody really wants to come to their mom and say, you know, I'm really liking this guy and we were kissing and blah, 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 whatever, you know, that's not what they want. But we wanted them to have that opportunity to have broken that ice, that if they got themselves into a situation, it was okay to come to us about that.
Yeah.
You know, that was super important for us to put that out there. And Anna will tell you, she remembers the day that we had the talk. And, you know, of course, she had already heard some stuff about it. And that's why she was asking some questions and we'd heard her whispering with some friends. And so we were like, yeah, we're past time, you know, like past time. And then, of course, once older sister knows, it's not long till younger sister knows, you know. So, I mean, but it was important. And I think that as the church, when we talk about the family being the building block of our culture or our society or whatever, we need to encourage our parents to have that conversation with their kids, and we need to do that by modeling that.
Yeah, that's I love that point. The family, the domestic church, like that's where if we're not having the conversations as a family, we're not going to be having the conversations in the church as a whole.
Right. You know, and so we had a lot of conversation in our family about the attention that your body brings you, and whether you want that attention or not, and what does that feel like, and if the way that you present yourself either brings more of that or not, you know. And so it wasn't a purity thing. It was really about them respecting themselves and honoring their selves until they were ready for some of that kind of attention.
Yeah. That was a good discussion. I think we've covered about everything we can.
I believe so.
Probably more. Probably more.
I mean, we talked about that. We use the terms vaginal intercourse and orgy.
We did.
I think, did we hit all our bingo card or did we miss some?
If this episode, crap, I said episode. No, this is not an episode. If this podcast doesn't go viral, then we probably won't ever have one. Oh, that's good stuff.
I did have a lady come in Monday. Was that the church Monday or Tuesday? Whenever the episode, no, whatever episode dropped on resurrection, and so she was like, "I just listened to your old podcast, and I have all these questions."
Oh wow! Brought a list of questions for you.
Oh yeah,
that's great.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Yeah, so
we must be doing something right.
We must be.
All right. Well, that will conclude us. So peace be to you, everyone, and have a good night. Thank you so much for tuning in. We really hope you got some enjoyment out of the podcast this week. Remember to check out our website, www.appalachianliturgy.com, and follow us on all of our social medias. Merch and Patreon is coming soon, so continue to check back for that as well. If you want an easy way to support us, though, make sure to subscribe to our channels and like our videos on YouTube. Also, join our email list for updates and let us know how we're doing. See you next week, everyone. Appalachian Liturgy Podcast is a JRS Studios production.